Hello everyone, welcome to the Peoria Riverfront Museum. My name is Renee Kerrigan, I'm Vice President of Programs here at the museum, and we're happy to have you all here today. This event will be recorded for posterity, so we'll have a link to this on our website and on the Labor Papers website so that a bunch of people will be able to see it in the future, but we're so happy to have you all here today. Again, welcome and thank you for coming to a panel discussion on the history of labor in Illinois. Thank you to our museum members and Visionary Society members who make programs like this possible. That we couldn't do these types of events without the support of our members. This event today is put on in conjunction with our exhibit that is currently on view. Celebrate Illinois, 200 Years in the Land of Lincoln. It's all about the history of Illinois, celebrating our state's bicentennial. You have until June 3rd to see this fantastic exhibit, which brings together objects from over 40 different lenders, over 200 objects in the exhibition that tell the story of Illinois history from agriculture to labor, as we're talking about today, the political history and cultural history of our state. You don't want to miss it. I hope you have a chance to see it. We have several events coming up that you might be interested in. On May 19th, we have Armed Forces Appreciation Day. Museum admission will be free to active duty members of the military, to veterans, and to Gold Star families. We'll be showing D-Day here in the Giant Screen Theater, and we'll have a lecture on Illinois and the Civil War. We also have another Illinois lecture series event from Hubble to Pluto, Astronomy in Illinois. That's coming up on May 22nd in our planetarium. And to extend his welcome to all of you, I'd like to introduce our President and CEO, Mr. John Morris.
Thank you, Renee. Greetings on this beautiful day. We are here for an important purpose, and that is to, in the spirit of the Peoria Riverfront Museum, the only multidisciplinary museum of its kind in the nation, art, science, history, and achievement. Here we use objects to tell stories and stories to inspire people. In a building that was built by labor, that was supported, one of the top 10 most generous gifts to build the Peoria Riverfront Museum came from labor, came from skilled labor. And every day in the year that I've been here, I have on my mind the importance of the quality of this facility that was built by our friends in labor. And when Dr. Reuben Soderstorm and I visited months ago now, at what was the end of a 10-year journey of writing a book about the 40 gals that belonged to his grandfather, Reuben Soderstorm. It struck me, in the spirit of our mission, that objects tell stories and stories inspire people, that these gavels had in them this incredible story of the promise of American opportunity and individual opportunity that Reuben's 40 years as president of the AFL and later AFL-CIO represented. So today, as we record this extraordinary conversation and presentation from our three panelists who we welcome on behalf of our board and staff, as we record it for posterity and those of you who join us, I simply want to say thank you on behalf of all of us. I also want to do one more thing, which is to get a little bit of exercise. And that is to say that I have here the three extraordinary volumes, 1 million words, 10 years in the making, of the story of labor in this country, the story of Reuben Soderstorm, but I think most importantly, and today as we have several hundred people gathering and coming through to do projects in our Learn It, Build It Day with the local trades and general contractors, I see waving above it all that giant American flag, and I really believe that there is in this story the story of America and American opportunity. And so I hold up for you all, if you haven't had a chance to have, I think Dr. Soderstrom carries one of these around with him every day at his dermatology clinic for good heart health. But this is an extraordinary 1 million word production that I think is unprecedented in the history of biographical work, probably in this country, certainly on a labor leader, if not anyone. So with that said, in the spirit of Reuben Soderstorm, who I think is smiling on us today as we come together to talk about this story, I say welcome to all of you. Thanks for being here, gentlemen, and I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you.
Renee.
Well, today I'd like to introduce our speakers to you. We have with us today Dr. Carl Soderstorm, who is the grandson of labor leader and 40-year president of the AFL-CIO, Reuben Soderstorm, and also one of the best-known physicians in Peoria. Thank you for coming, Dr. Soderstorm. We have Chris Stevens, who is a graduate of Knox College. He has pursued writing for organized labor. His interest in labor history, and with 20 years as a labor writer for the labor paper here in Peoria, make him an accomplished speaker on this topic. And Mike Matejka, who is the Government Affairs Director for the Great Plains Labor District Council. Since 1980, he has edited the Great Prairie Union News. He's Vice President of the Illinois Labor History Society, speaks frequently on labor and history topics, and is the author of Fiery Struggle, Illinois Firefighters Build a Union. So let's extend our welcome and thank you to our panelists today. And Dr. Soderstorm, if you want to lead the discussion.
You want to give me the mic?
Do I need a speaker thing?
There you go.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you, John. And it's my great pleasure to be here and a tremendous honor to bring to the forefront the history of our laboring men and women, to remind them of where they have come and to remind them what battles were fought in the past for the benefits that they have today that we have to continue to fight for. I was thinking last night, why should someone buy this book? And I thought that when you go back and think about the Declaration of Independence, and our forefathers wrote that we should pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know, life basically was given to us for those religious folks by God, and our liberties have been fought for by our soldiers and our armies over a couple of hundred years now. But the pursuit of happiness was the remaining piece. And Reuben thought that America had gotten a little bit ahead of itself 100 years ago, in that there was huge corporations, huge wealthy people, and many of the working people had been left behind. So I felt that along with the Bible by your bedside, this volume of books should be at the bedside of laboring people, because it's their history, and it shows them how an idealist, who was my grandfather, spent his life developing the laws and the rules and the roadway in which the pursuit of happiness could become a reality. Now, you know, everyone's pursuit of happiness is defined by what they're happy with. Some want a good job, some want a good spouse, some want a nice home, some want their kids to go to college, some just want to spend a lot of time fishing. But no matter what your pursuit of happiness is, it took the rest of those things to get us there. And what my grandfather found out as he began work at age 9 in a blacksmith shop was that he was unable to pursue happiness. He was unable to go to school. He only went to 6th grade, self-educated himself in the Streeter Public Library, and became one of America's greatest writers and orators. One of the reasons I wanted to write the book was because his writings are so beautiful. And if you get the book and look at these, the plaques that we chose of his more famous speeches and writings we put around the Streeter Plaza up there. The one that strikes me the most is the Carpenter of Nazareth. I've never seen anything written more beautifully than the Carpenter of Nazareth. Also, he wrote one called The Martyrs of Labor, and talks about how we today are standing here with the benefits of what those martyrs of labor did, those folks who in the past tried to form together to make life better for themselves and were fired from their jobs or killed on the line or worked to death, or women who worked 12, 14, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, or children who worked from age 8 or 9 in coal mines. And they used to send the kids into the narrowest, smallest shafts because they were the only people who could fit into those narrow shafts. And this, my friends, happened all around here in our coal mines and in our factories. And when my grandfather moved to Illinois from Minnesota in 1900, these were the conditions. He went to work first as a trolley line water boy, and then as a glass bottle factory worker at age 12 in Owens, Illinois glass factory, where the temperatures in those lines are 120 degrees or so, and led one of the first strikes against some of those conditions. Interesting, because the German bottle blowers made the most money blowing the bottles and blowing the glass. The next in line were the Italians, but that was basically janitorial work because they didn't know English and it couldn't be understood. And the American kids were put in as sweep-up boys and clutter kids cleaning up the messes, and they went on strike in a Labor Day parade, 300 of them, because they wanted to have the American kids have a better opportunity than the Italian workers who couldn't speak English but who were getting the promotions. So you can see how in those days ethnicity made a big difference, religion made a big difference, race made a big difference in how we treated our workers. My grandfather was very impressed with our forefathers and Abraham Lincoln. And I was talking with John earlier, and how many of you know that the emancipation, we all know what it did, right? It freed the slaves. But that's not true. If you read the Emancipation, it freed the slaves and indentured servants. That's in Lincoln's own handwriting. The white folks, mainly up north, many of them came from Europe. Many were indentured servants. They were indentured by low wages, abuse in the factories. They were indentured by contracts that made them work for years and years to pay off their portage fees. Children were sent as orphans all around the country on trains to become orphans in whatever town the train let them off at. These basically became indentured servants. And the thing that Lincoln knew that Reuben worked his life to fix was that both the black slaves and the indentured white slaves up north needed an economic base to pursue happiness. So by changing laws and fixing what was wrong in an ideal world, Reuben made history and made America so much greater. He passed some of the first child labor laws in the state of Illinois. He was a state representative for 20 years, so he went to Springfield. When he saw a problem, he went there as an uneducated man, saw the problem, wrote the laws, passed the laws, and then implemented the laws. This is an incredible person, very brilliant. So when he saw child labor, he went to Springfield to pass laws to fix it. When he saw women pregnant and with children working 7 days a week, 8, 10, 12 hours a day, he went to Springfield and got the 8-hour bill passed for women 5 days a week. When he saw people underpaid, he and my dad, who was also a state representative, passed prevailing wage laws so everyone could rise as things got better. When old people had to go to old age homes and die there, men on one side, women on the other, man and woman, husband and wife separated, he passed a bill for old age pensions so people could live at home until they passed away. And that bill was a forerunner of what Franklin Roosevelt used, and Reuben and he were friends, and Reuben consulted with Roosevelt to pass our first Social Security legislation. So workman's comp and unemployment insurance came out of the disasters at the Cherry Mine crisis and the radium girls in Ottawa. Reuben was a state representative during both of those things. During the Cherry Mine disaster, he was also a linotype operator, so he set the press. He set the type in Streator, Illinois, in the press office when he was setting the type of his friends who died at Cherry Mine in that disaster. And Chris Stevens went up to Streator many, many times digging through all the old newspapers, and we found all this fascinating information. When you think about a man who discovers and realizes and feels pain in society and then goes to change the law, write the law, and make it better, you have found a very, very incredible man. There was 10 or 20 major laws that Reuben sponsored and had passed. Many of our legislators today, legislators, are there for 10, 20, 30 years and never have a law that they created passed, ever. And so to think that someone created and wrote the law and then got it passed was amazing. There are so many other stories that Reuben did that when Sharon Williams from town here came to my house to see if I knew this man and if we could sponsor some things with the labor unions here in town, she introduced me to Chris Stevens, who then we started to look into his life. And I can tell you that I knew him as a wonderful grandfather. He had offices in Springfield, offices in Chicago, and he would come home on the weekends and on the middle of the week. And I just knew him as Grandpa. And we took walks, and he taught me a lot of things. And a lot of times he and my dad were in the kitchen. They'd be talking about bills and legislation, so I'd pick up on a lot of it. But my main interest was whether he would get me a bicycle or I could get a new shirt, or at some point if I could go on vacation with him or something like that. So the way we wrote the book, and I'll sort of stop some of the stories, but the way we wrote the book was to, first of all, we wrote the book through a private publishing company, which I created. We did that because so many times when you go to publishers, they want to influence what you write. Or if you go to editors, they are paid by somebody more than just the publishing company, and sometimes you can't say what you want to say. So labor unions never really get to tell their story a lot of times. And a lot of famous labor leaders and people who sacrifice for others never have their story told. And when you hear about a strike or an improvement, you don't hear about the people who sacrificed to make those benefits and make those gains happen. The time away from home, the personal sacrifice, the threats, and all the rest that are still real today. So we wanted to write this book from a laboring person's point of view, unadulterated with any outside influences, and that's what we did. So it took a little longer because it was a pretty big project. Also, I think that when we got to work on this, we got a lot of interest from the University of Illinois, who now wants a statue there in a plaza, and the labor building down in Springfield wants a statue in a plaza. So we're doing those things. And we're also trying to educate the public as much as possible, educate our working folks today as much as possible, because it's very, very important to remember this history, because if we don't remember it, we're going to repeat mistakes. And so my son wanted us to write this book so that, in essence, laboring people in other countries like China and India and Africa, where their conditions aren't so good, could actually use some of the ideas and models that Reuben used to gain benefits here. They could use those in their countries. So the book was written with a lot of things in mind. We also put in there some religious material, because Reuben was the son of a Lutheran minister and a very religious sort of guy. He also had a lot of family involved in his work, and so we've celebrated the family. And we also took the 12 major pillars that Reuben actually accomplished throughout his life and made those standout chapters within the book, so that people realized the pillars that he built this greater society that he envisioned on. And each one of those pillars required legislation and rule changes, support. He built the AFL from 1930, about 200,000 members, to over 1.5 million about a decade or so later. And he did a lot of amazing things. And one of those amazing things, for example, was in the Second World War. He talked with President Roosevelt. Actually, he and Roosevelt campaigned in Mendota, Illinois. Reuben was running for state representative, and Roosevelt at that time was running for vice president. That was before Roosevelt had polio. And we got pictures from there that we found. So it was pretty amazing. But in the Second World War, Illinois was such an industrial state that they produced a huge number of tanks and weapons and guns and ammunition that Reuben promised Roosevelt that Illinois would not go on strike. None of the workers in Illinois would go on strike during the Second World War to help make sure that we won. And then after the war, of course, that was a little different story when all the troops came home. But those kinds of major national events all occurred because of Reuben and labor here in Illinois. So at that, I'm going to turn over to my colleagues Chris, who's helped write the book, and Mike Matejka, who he helped write the book too. Amazing mind with the labor history. And so I think, Chris, why don't we just go ahead and I didn't show any of my pictures because we just got to talking.
That's okay. All right. Hello. Hi, everybody.
Hello. Hi, Chris.
Thanks for coming out. First thing I want to do is I want to thank John Morris, and I want to thank Renee and the museum for having us here. Second thing I want to thank is I want to thank Doc, because he's kind of the general manager, head coach, and he drafted me in the first round, and I had a great time. What I want to do today is I want to just talk a little bit about just one instance. It shows how interconnected everything is when someone like Reuben makes something good happen. And the instance I'm going to take is that it's very surprising. Now, we got this quote up here. Everybody's pretty familiar with it. It's the Theodore Roosevelt quote. You know, it's not the person, you know, we can take just a few seconds to read through it. You know, it's not the critic who points out how, blah, blah, blah. What it really comes down to is that that's Reuben. What I mean by that's Reuben is that he wasn't afraid to get down on the floor. He wasn't afraid to be where the fighting was. He wasn't afraid to be where the blood and the sweat and the tears were. And that's really, really important. And in fact, this has got some ironic real connections, which is one of the reasons I chose this particular quote. I can tell you right now that this was delivered in 1910 at the Sorbonne in Paris by Theodore Roosevelt. That's the Roosevelt, by the way, that's my hero, not Franklin. I like Teddy better. But anyway, 1910, he talked about this. What's the importance of this when I say that was Reuben? The importance of this is when you're on the arena floor in the middle of the fight, you're not thinking about yesterday and you're not thinking about tomorrow. You're focused on right now. Because if not, you get defeated. It's real simple. And he didn't win every one of his fights. And in fact, the best part about one of the things I learned is that he clearly knew that it was just about that you have to be in the fight, that the only failure is to not try. Okay, so now I'm going to get a little bit deeper on this here. This is 1910 when Theodore Roosevelt delivered this little speech. And I said it was Reuben, right? Well, one of the reasons he was an extraordinary leader is that he had that quality. What's that quality that all leaders have? Hey, listen. He knew what had gone wrong in his life, but he had to know that it went wrong in other people's lives too. Because everyone in here, I'm sure, knows what's happened in their life. We've all had good things and bad things happen. And so how he transformed it was that by listening to what had happened to other people, and then he knew where he was coming from. Okay? So, 1910, when Theodore Roosevelt delivered this, it just so happens that in 1910, 17 women workers in the sweatshops of Hart, Schaffner, and Marx in Chicago, which, by the way, was a larger industry than the meatpacking. Everybody talks about meatpacking in Chicago. Actually, the garment industry was the largest industry in Chicago. Well, 17 women in 1910 walked off the job over working conditions. Became a big famous strike, Hart, Schaffner, and Marx. Sidney Hillman from New York, the International Lady Garment Workers, president came in, negotiated a deal, this and that, blah, blah, blah. To cut to the chase, what happened is they decided to set up an arbitration board. Clarence Darrow was in charge of the arbitration board. Okay, the women went back to work, everything was fine. After a couple of years, Clarence Darrow didn't have time, and so the impartial arbitrator was John E. Williams. And John E. Williams happened to be Reuben's mentor. If Reuben ever truly had a mentor, it was John E. Williams from Streator. Because he wrote a newspaper column in the newspaper that Reuben worked for. He's the one that got him his library card. He's the one that told him what to read. They had serious discussions for years. He was clearly Reuben's mentor. Well, John E. Williams, like I said, turns out he's the arbitrator for the International Lady Garment Workers Union in Chicago. Well, in 1917, which was right prior to when Reuben was going to win his first election as a state representative, he lost twice in 14 and 16. Well, in 17, when he was getting ready to run for a primary, in February, the lady garment workers went on strike again. And the reason they went on strike over working conditions. And so what happened? Dennis Sullivan, a judge in Chicago, you know what he did? He put 90 people that worked there in jail because they violated an injunction. There were 67 women and 23 men went to jail in Chicago because they went on strike and had defied an injunction. And now, without getting too deep into it, so you read the book, Reuben had some serious problems with injunctions himself. So he could clearly relate to that, okay? And one of the women that this judge put in jail for that strike was a woman named Florence Korn, who weighed 130 pounds, was 5'2". And he put her in jail and fined her $100 because he claimed she beat up a real burly detective on the picket line. And so, right away, the first thing Reuben did when he won election in 1918, and obviously him and John Williams were speaking throughout the entire time, because that's who his mentor was. Reuben went there, and his the very first thing Reuben did in January in 1919, when he was a state representative, was he introduced an injunction limitation bill. Now, it didn't pass, because corporate America managed to get rid of it, because they didn't want people to form unions. To cut to the chase, what ultimately ended up happening is in 1925, Reuben was able to pass that law. And we got injunction limitation in Illinois prior to all the federal legislation about it. Now, what that did was that allowed unions to organize. Prior to that, it was very difficult to organize a union because all the owner had to do of a company was get a judge to say, I want an injunction that says these people can't picket. And Reuben passed that. And so there's a direct line to the women that worked in the sweatshops. Without them, and without Johnny Williams being the arbitrator, who probably talked to Reuben would have had the concern about injunctions, no question, because of the difficulty in his life. But he was clearly getting in his ear when he was about to win an election as a state representative, how important it was to everybody. Specifically, these women workers in the largest industry in Chicago. And the one last thing I want to say before I turn it over to Mike is what's really clever, and then I'm going to tease you because you really do want to read the book. That's just one instance of the amazing things that happened. There were two people. There was a former senator. It was, I can't read it from here. I'm sorry. I'm not going to here. It was former U.S. Senator James Hamilton and a congressional aide named Thomas Spelling. They actually wrote a book about how Reuben was able to get injunction limitation passed in Illinois. Because what he did was he did the exact opposite. Instead of telling everybody what couldn't be done or what they could do, he passed a law that said what they couldn't do. In other words, all the attempts prior that had failed, they had wanted to make legal picketing, they wanted to make legal leafleting, they wanted to make legal this, and so it always failed. So what he did was he wrote a law that said, what we're going to do is this is the only thing that you can't do. You can't do any violence, you can't do anything that's going to harm the business. So it passed. And that was it. And we had it first. And with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Mike. And the reason I'm gonna leave it there is because it's just one little tidbit. I mean, literally, folks, I've been on that book project from day one, and there are hundreds of instances in the book, things just like that, where it was actually ordinary people that would come to Reuben and say, you know, I need this done. You know, I need that done. Would you real quickly please just put up the number 2 of mine? One of the reasons I had this be number 2 is because since I was talking about women is one of the fun things about if you do research on the Typographers Union, which he was a member of, they had women members just like they had men members. It made no difference to them. I mean, in the early 1900s. Let's go to number 3 real quick. As a matter of fact, look at that picture. There's a woman sitting at a typography machine, and that's the early 1900s. One of the few unions that was like that. They didn't discriminate. They didn't care. If you could do the job, you could do the job. And that's something I think that clearly influenced Reuben. I mean, from day one, the union that he was in was an all-inclusive, diverse union. And so I'm sure that that helped him a lot. But anyway, I'm now going to turn it over to Mike Matejka so he can talk about some general labor. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Doctor. I'm going to try to maybe contextualize this, but again, this is really an epic effort that Dr. Soderstorm put together here. And again, that kind of comprehensive history is very rarely done in that kind of span. So it really does deserve commendation. What I want to do is maybe put Reuben and Illinois labor in the larger context of what's going on at the time period. And here's something I do when I talk to high school kids, and they get perplexed at me. The first question I ask them is, what form of government do we have in the United States? And they look at each other funny, and they're like, does this guy know? And one of them finally says, democracy. I said, who here has ever had a job? Tell me the form of government where you work. And then the kids get really perplexed, and they look at each other, and one will finally mumble, dictatorship, monarchy. I said, yeah. Our American ideal is what? One person, one vote, we're all equal. But when we go to work, are we equal? How do we have a voice in our daily life when it is the majority of our waking hours? And that, to me, is the core essence of why labor unions are organized, is to give people a voice, a say, and what happens to them during that critical part of their life where they're earning their living. And that struggle to find that voice within American society and within American law is something that goes back to colonial times. But when we look at the history of labor in the United States, Illinois is the epicenter. You know, beginning again with 1877, a volcanic great uprising of people across the country, Haymarket and the 8-hour day fight in 1886, the Pullman strike in 1894, the garment worker strikes that Chris referred to, the stockyards, the coal mines throughout the state. How do people get a voice? And the government system, the corporate system was not willing to give them that because they knew it would cost. It would cost them a share of the profits. And so Illinois became this battleground where very prominent people, whether Clarence Darrow, who's mentioned, Eugene Debs, Jane Addams, Mother Jones, this was a place where they came to work and to fight amongst themselves sometimes of how do we build a movement to give people that voice. And I think the other part where Reuben is critical because of the dual roles he plays, there's 2 ways to do that. One is organize in the workplace. Form a union, get a contract, have a say in your wages, your working conditions, your safety, and what happens to you. But you can't do that effectively unless you also politically organize. And that's where Reuben, being both a state legislator and a labor leader, played a really critical role. Because as Chris mentioned with injunctions, people can strike, people can protest, but the moment you strike and protest, you get a court injunction, which makes that an illegal activity, then your rights are curtailed and you're never going to get any self-elevation or move yourself forward. So being able to operate politically, to pass laws, whether they're safety laws, whether they're 8-hour day laws, workers' compensation laws, anti-injunction laws, that's critical because it benefits not just the union member, but every person working for a living, and at the same time, building an opportunity for people to have an organization, to have a say in what goes on in their daily life, is what building a union is all about. So that a person can have a voice, a democratic, and I tell the students, small d democratic, not political party democratic, but a democratic voice in what happens to them in the majority of their working hours every day. And Reuben played in both spheres, combined the two of them, and became a very effective voice to be able to do that. And I think the other thing too, labor has its internal issues. Like any organization, society, it's not perfect. One area that the doctor did not talk about, where Reuben was a real leader, and Chris alluded to this with the gender equality, many unions were very racist and excluded people because of race or gender. Many unions up through the 1910s, 20s, and 30s had in their constitutions, we are a whites-only organization. Reuben saw that as a challenge, as a problem, because he learned in Springfield he could not pass legislation without the support of African American legislators. He also realized that's patently an unfair thing to do. So even before Martin Luther King was on the steps of Lincoln Memorial saying, "I have a dream," he was speaking to the Illinois AFL-CIO convention. And Reuben went out of his way to push labor to open its own ranks to be inclusive of all working people. So even in his later years, he was seeing issues emerging that labor had to take a stand, had to change itself to be more inclusive and to be more responsive to the society around it. And again, he's just one of many stellar people, national figures that play out in the state of Illinois. And what plays out in the state of Illinois, so many laws, whether it was child labor law, anti-injunction law, we were the first state in the country to do those. And it's thanks to people like Reuben in labor and also in politics that makes those transitions possible. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm presuming we've got time for question, comment, anything anybody would like to do. We're open. And I don't know, just to make sure, because I know this is being podcast recorded, do we need to pass the microphone to catch the questions? Good.
Has anybody got questions?
Yeah. I don't know.
AFL is the
Hold on, let's get
American
this on.
Federation of Labor.
Let's get this on a microphone, okay?
Oh,
I know AFL stands for American Federation of Labor. What does CIO stand for, and what does that encompass, the AFL? Who's underneath it?
Okay. Is this one on?
Yes.
All right, good.
Started out as committee, but then
Right.
it went to Congress.
The American Federation of Labor was founded in 1881 and really built itself as a powerhouse, 4 million members by 1901, but organized people by craft, and particularly skilled workers. And if you look out front of the museum here today, you see people who go through apprenticeship, who have a skill, who an employer cannot easily replace because of that skill. Where the AFL had a difficult time was organizing the unskilled worker. The person on the assembly line, the person who is doing work that may not require years of training and can also be easily replaced. And the challenge was the AFL became very effective at organizing, like Peoria. Peoria is a wonderful example of an AFL town. If you came here in 1910 or 1915, you would have found the union label in every barber shop and every bar, on almost every construction site in town and every foundry. But Caterpillar wasn't organized. And of course, Caterpillar comes along more after World War I. That's an industrial workplace. So John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers pushed this issue of industrial organizing. He could not get the AFL to totally buy into it. Part of it too, he had a huge ego and he wanted to be the leader.
Yeah.
So he broke off a faction of unions and started the Committee for Industrial Organizations, what became the Congress of Industrial Organizations in 1937. United Auto Workers, United Steel Workers. Let's go out and organize industry, mass production industry, and the other key that Lewis had with that is we don't organize a workplace in one town, we organize every GM plant. We organize every United Steel steel mill. So it's industry-wide organization and really taking on the large capitalist enterprises. And eventually in 1955, the two organizations come back together again. But it's two models of organizing. One model is skill-based, trade-based. The other model is industrial, you know, the big, huge enterprises.
There's some interesting history with that too. One of the interesting parts about that he accurately pointed out was that the way CIO organized was by, you know, entire industry. Well, what's interesting about that is that when they allowed them to do that, they then excluded with legislation supervisors and managers and so on and so forth. And what's interesting is that the unions in Japan only organize each plant, but everybody but the top 3 executives is in the union. So that's why they don't have labor problems, is because the superintendent is a union member. He's not part of management. The only people that aren't in the union in Japan are the top 3 executives at the company. Everybody else is. But however, they don't have the power of a UAW and all Japan union. So there are some cities and factories where they obviously get a great deal, and there's other cities and factories where they get a horrible deal because they don't have their own strong leadership. So there's, of course, advantages and disadvantages to the whole thing.
One of the amazing political maneuvers that I think my grandfather did so brilliantly was in 1958, when in Illinois the AFL and CIO finally merged. Is it took an extra couple of years because the AFL and the CIO memberships and leaderships were jockeying for power. And my grandfather was able to put the two unions together and come out still the president of both, and went on for another 10 or 12 years as president of both the AFL-CIO. So, and that's when we came together to discover all these things and write the book, was in 1958 when they had the merger convention here. In 2008, they had the 50th anniversary of that merger, and that's when Sharon Williams here in town came and found me, and we discovered this common interest, and we spent the last 10 years writing the book. So I thought it was, with all the upheaval that was going on, and Reuben by then was 70-some years old, 75 years old, and he still came out on top of 1 million, 2 million workers, whatever it was, and I thought that was a pretty amazing political feat.
Yeah, great, good. Let's get a, yes.
Doctor, you're right, because our own father was involved with this since he was the first president of the local AFL-CIO here in Peoria, and they did not merge until 1960, I think their charter is, and he spent time with your grandfather, and I think the last local, the last AFL-CIO group that merged might have been in Joliet, but they too came about 1960. So he did bring about all that. But going back to the original question about the AFL-CIO, of course, those who were anti-labor, I don't know if the AFL would refer to the CIO as the Communist International Organization. That's what the anti-union people, of course, made it out. But I had intended to ask a question kind of relating to this whole thing. How did Reuben and John L. Lewis, because John L. Lewis sometimes was guilty of raiding and so forth, and I didn't know what kind of relationship those two men would have had at that time.
Well, Reuben spoke very, very highly of John L. Lewis, and I know that each one of us grandchildren wrote a high school theme on John L. Lewis. And in the early days, the state AFL rented space in the United Mine Workers office building in Springfield. And Reuben and John L. Lewis were friends, close friends. Actually, you know, they had a lot in common, even though they were had different organizing strategies. They nevertheless were similar in their main goals. And there was a lot of communication back and forth. They had some falling out in the late 30s when John L. Lewis pulled his folks and his miners out of the AFL, and they went on to have kind of a contentious relationship for a decade or so, because John L. Lewis was very flamboyant and actually in the end kind of lost prestige nationally. Reuben, on the other hand, separated from that, was more of a conciliator, but nevertheless just as persistent. And I think Reuben survived much longer as leader of his organizations. Another interesting thing is my sister, my younger sister, when she was writing her theme about John L. Lewis for high school, she actually wrote to John L. and he was in a nursing home, I think in North Carolina, and my grandfather sent him the request from my sister that John L. tell her something about his life, and John L. sent a very, very nice letter back respecting my grandfather Reuben and my sister. These were two war horses who were strategically brilliant, tremendous orators, great writers, wonderful leaders. The membership loved them, and they, of course, with that kind of power and that kind of personality, would have some conflicts and some clashes. But they both had the same causes in mind. They both helped their own millions of people, represented them quite loyally. And I think another interesting thing that you brought up about the CIO-AFL merger is part of the reason it took 2 or 3 years to merge is there were some avowed communists in the CIO. And Reuben would not accept them into the AFL until those people were eliminated and not brought in, and which happened. They eliminated some officers that were avowed communists, and so that was part of the reason it took longer. But the other part was the maneuvering, so he wasn't going to merge them if he wasn't the leader. And I think that just shows a little bit about his persistence and his force de jour, so to speak, in that he, going through the legislature and creating laws and then implementing them and then reinforcing them, he knew what he wanted and he knew what to do to help people get better, and he just liked that role of being able to do that in his own mind without a whole lot of impositions around, and he knew that if he wasn't president, he'd lose a lot of power. So I can tell you, sitting around the kitchen table eating ginger snaps with him on Saturday night, there wasn't going to be a merger until everyone agreed that he was going to be the president.
Let me also ask you, you said your grandfather made a pledge to the president, no strike. Did he have any reaction when John L. Lewis pulled his strike of the mine workers during the war?
Yeah, well, you see, that was a huge issue that Reuben was very altruistic towards the workers. He was very American first, and he knew Roosevelt as friends before he became a leader and before Roosevelt became president. So there was a cordial relationship. Reuben also realized that, and when you read the book, you'll see he denounced Nazism in the 1930s and communism, and he's the first one to say that capitalism is the growth engine that so far at least has made the greatest, wealthiest society in the world. He was also for unionism. So capitalism and unionism were his calling cards, because let capitalism create and build wealth and make new ideas and new things, but let's make sure that we have strong unionism so that the workers get their fair share of all that goes forward. So my grandfather knew that without America, there wouldn't be any John L. miners or anything else if we didn't support the war and protect our country. We had to do that first. And so that he was not happy with John L. Lewis. They had a nice falling out at that point, and the book quotes some of their amazingly rhetorical terms they called each other, probably more rhetorical and pleasant than what we would call them today, but they had words for each other. But I also think that if you look at the 1949 chapter, I think, as soon as that war was over, Reuben came out and said that basically we should get the United Nations together to eliminate not only the atomic bomb, which was devastating, but also he proclaimed that we should eliminate all war, that there was nothing good for societies that that came of war. And whether it was our own troops being killed or our own factory workers, there was more workers killed in factory accidents during the Second World War than there were soldiers on the battlefield. That is a fact. And we looked up all the data on that, and so to making all these tanks and cars and guns and weapons and explosives, more workers were killed than soldiers. And so Reuben, at the end of the war, he said, well, it's wonderful that our soldiers won the war over there, but the workers of America won the war over here because we supplied them with everything they needed to win the war. And don't forget that without the workers, you never would have had the supplies you needed to win the war. So Grandpa was always very eager to make sure that the working man and woman got their right claim to fame and their right acknowledgement for the contribution that they made. And I can tell you, I listened to many, many speeches that he was practicing when we'd go on vacation and things that was just a theme that he never veered from that.
One thing I would like to add about the AFL-CIO merger, I kept saying there's hundreds of little tidbits of cool information in the book. Well, guess who made the motion in December 5th, 1955 at the AFL National Convention to merge with the CIO? Reuben Soderstorm. This book is filled with so many little tidbits of information like that, it's incredible.
I think that's
Another big thing that Reuben and John L. Lewis differed about. Reuben always wanted all the unions to speak as one, so that there's a great power. He saw that when he was in the legislature, that if you could speak as one for all the working people, then you had tremendous power. And what John L. Lewis did was he split the power of the unions, and oftentimes politicians in Washington would use the CIO against the AFL and vice versa, so they kept a kind of a conflict going. And Reuben always wanted to eliminate that and always speak as one. So I think that was another difference.
Any other questions?
I have one last question, unless there's anyone else. The gavels, 40 gavels, which really helped spark the Peoria Riverfront Museum's interest in telling this extraordinary story, and thank you all for doing it. Dr. Soderstrom, I know they belong to your grandfather, but when you received them, can you tell us the story of when you got them, how you got them, when you realized they had this story hidden in them that you have brought to life in this book and we bring to life in the galleries here?
Yeah, John. Well, Grandpa was always proud of anything union made. And if you could think back about the days when I was a child in Streeter, Illinois, if there was a union on strike, we couldn't cross the picket line. If there was one union out, none of the other unions would cross that picket line in those days. And I had a strong love for the reasons people joined together. And so when Reuben would go off to have his annual conventions, he'd always bring home his gavel. And the gavel was a union-made, carpenter-made, union-labeled gavel. Each one's different for every year. They're beautifully carved out of all sorts of different types of wood. But he'd bring that home, and I knew it was a treasure because he would show everyone, and he was proud of it. And when we went back and found many, many pictures stored all over the state of Illinois in different libraries, we found pictures of him at conventions. He always had the gavel in his hand, no matter what. And when Lyndon Johnson came to Peoria at Reuben's invitation to help Lyndon Johnson save his election, the Secret Service tried to take Reuben's gavel away because he was walking Johnson to the stage, and the Secret Service tried to take the gavel, and Reuben told him, he says, no, I'm the president, and this is my gavel. And they did not take it away from him. But he was so proud of those, and he'd bring them home, and then he'd put them in the lower drawer of his clothing chiffre, his chest. And every year he added them. And once in a while I'd go in and try to play with them a little bit, and he would say, oh, no, let me show you. I'll show you what this is, but we're not taking them out. And when he passed away, that was just one of the things I wanted to make sure we got and preserved, and I kept them. And all of everyone's life in our family, we were always wanted to write a story about him. And close to his death, last days, he mentioned that if he ever did write his story, he would call it 40 Gavels. He was very, very proud of that. But more than that, when I say, well, Grandpa, why don't you write it? He would say, well, Carl, he said, you know, I've already written it. I've spoken it, I've written it. All you gotta do is go read what I wrote. And all it did was take 4 people, 10 years, to find, dig up, locate what he wrote and what he spoke. It's 500 speeches that we found, and probably 5,000 that we didn't find, and recordings and all the rest. So his work was voluminous, and it was much, much greater job than we ever thought, but it's beautiful. And I encourage you to get the book, only to read what he wrote, because his prose is so beautiful. I always admired that. I can't write that well, and I know, John, you're going to do that tonight. Go home and read those. You got to go home and read the 12 plaques in the third volume, the plaques that are at the Streeter Plaza. Those are beautiful English writings, and I think you'll stay up till you finish all 12 of them. Thank you very much.